My dog is playing with her little toy. It might be a bit loud, but we're gonna go along with it because I want her to enjoy her time while I film. Darling, you send me, I know you send me. Hello friends and family, welcome back to my channel. Today I have another book video. I've been reading quite a lot recently. There really isn't much to do. I mean, the social distancing rules have kind of like relaxed a little bit in Hong Kong, but I've still been staying home. Maybe it's not related to COVID anymore, but I've just been staying home quite a lot. So I'm filming this a little bit late because it's already March, but I'm so proud of myself because I'm pumping out more videos than I used to. Yeah, so as always, if you do have a book recommendation, please let me know either on Instagram or below. I'm still in the market for a lot of new books. I want to read more and I want to read less just for school. I mean, I still have to read for school, but like I want to read less for school because I want to read more for myself. Okay, so I'm gonna get on with today's video because we have 12 books that are super heavy to lift up to show you, but I read 12 books in February. And honestly, I'm super proud of myself. There are class books in here. There's two that are class books, but I thought I'd share with you anyways because I did enjoy them quite a bit. So the first book we have is Dream Arteries by Finder Dulai. This is a collection of poetry. It's not exactly a novel in verse. It's really just a collection. I mean, I guess you could look at it. It's more like it's a multimedia sort of book. Like there's photos in here as well, and there's well, they're not just photos, they're like archival photos of the people on the Komagata Maru. And this is a book for my Asian lit class. It is so good. I think this is the book that made me find my love for poetry again, because I kind of lost it a little bit and I felt like it was a very elitist thing that I couldn't attain to, and I was insecure again. But anyway, it's about the South Asian, or Indian specifically, migration to Canada or Vancouver through the Komagata Maru. And I believe it's a very important read if you were in Vancouver, or well, just in general. I think it is a very important read. It does depict their journey very well, and there's a lot of pain and difficulties, and it really, like, if you don't know the story of the Komagata Maru, there's also a really good podcast that I listened to about the Komagata Maru, so it might help you paint this image better before you go in to actually read the poetry. And I'll link it down below. It's a little bit complex because it's not the easiest poetry and it takes some time. It took a few rereads to get it, but I think Dulai does a very, very good job because he does have all these archival photos and he paints this, or he writes this really beautiful imagery into his poetry. So if you were looking for a poetry book, I suggest this one. Oh, and this was definitely a 5 out of 5. This was so beautifully written. So the next book I have is Freshwater by Apaki Umazi. I just learned this word recently. This is a Bildungsroman. So what Bildungsroman mean is a novel dealing with one person's formative years or spiritual education. This is definitely the case for this book. This was a 4 out of 5 stars for me. It is so well written, as are a lot of the books in the list that I've read this month. It is a bit difficult to get into in the beginning because I did go into this book thinking that it was a coming of age, which it is, but there's a lot more layers than just the coming of age element. So I think I went in with the wrong idea. But then once you get around 50 pages in, the pace picks up a little bit, and you also get to know what the author is trying to do and the themes that they're trying to convey. So the author does use some of her experiences in this novel, and she does write. So it is part fictional, but it is based off of some of her experiences. So Ada is written as someone that's like an obanji who's just kind of meant to torment the mother, essentially. And Ada also develops these separate selves throughout her coming of age time. And in an article, the author explains obanjis as an Igbo spirit that's born into a human body. And they're kind of like a malevolent trickster. And like I said, they're kind of meant to torment the mother. And the author has spoken about how the legend of the obanji has kind of helped her understand her own traumatic experiences, and just as Ada comes to realize herself. You can think of it as the film Inside Out, but which I don't think is the right way to really go about it. Maybe that's like a little touchstone because I don't want to westernize the story at all, but there are these kind of factors or spirits inside Ada's head which kind of guides her personality and helps her, or sometimes doesn't really help her, deal with these events that she goes through in her life. But the author looks at these differentiating factors or personages and then how Ada ends up coming to accept this multiplicity of identity. It's not just like one identity, which I think is really interesting, and I feel like we all go through something like that. It's not as simple as just one size fits all, or there's just one personality. There's different ones that kind of come out throughout life, and then I think the author does it or explains it very well. And it's also interesting to read about the author's own experiences as well. So if you have the time, read this and also look up the author. I also have her other novel, Pet, and I think that's a YA one that I was supposed to read actually for a children's lit class, but then last year and then COVID ended up happening and that book was taken out of syllabus. But I'm gonna read that book. The only thing I wish there was that there was more of Ada, because a lot of the book is narrated by the different spirits inside her head, which I think is okay, but I do wish that there was a bit more of Ada and maybe how she was feeling, even though I guess the spirits is her, but yeah, if that makes sense. So the next book I read is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. So dang good, you guys. It is a novel written in verse, so each poem tells the story, the whole story essentially, and it is so beautiful. I loved it so much. This is another one of those books, if you want to get back into poetry, this is also the one to read. It is so well written, and each poem I believe can even be its own standalone thing, but then if you read the whole thing together, then you get the full story of The Poet X. So without further explanation, this was a 5 out of 5 for me. So it's about the Poet X. As you can see, it's another coming of age novel, and the Poet X is called Xiomara, and you can see how she kind of defines her own identity as well, and then how she deals with being Catholic, or being brought up Catholic and having a very strict Catholic mother, and how with that, how she ends up discovering her own sexuality and finding her own femininity. And I think Elizabeth Acevedo does a very, very good job. It is so beautifully written. I loved it from the beginning all the way to the end. There wasn't a part where I was like, oh, I wish I could like just get over this poem or skip through a poem. Like, it is all so well written. So I highly recommend this. I cried a little bit in this, but I'm not one to always get super emotional. I mean, okay, no, I am. But like, I don't sob, but I did cry in this one quite a bit, and it is really hard to read at some parts too, but a very good read. And the next book I read is Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. I read this for Noelle, Joel, and Elias's book club. It's called the Late Night Book Club, and I have to watch their show. It was just filmed this morning, or this morning, so I'm gonna read it. I'm gonna watch it later. So this was a 3 out of 5 stars for me. Wasn't my favorite. It was a good story. It's a good thriller. And looking at the cover, I wouldn't have thought it was a thriller. I just thought it was some like YA novel. But then the first page, literally, I don't think this is a spoiler because it's right on the first page and also on the synopsis. So we follow this character called Enchanted Jones, and she's a teenager aspiring to be a singer. She ends up joining this competition that's kind of like The Voice or X Factor. And in this competition, she meets this famous artist, Corey Fields. And right from the start, the first page literally says Corey Fields is dead and Enchanted Jones is near his body, or in the same room vicinity of him, and she is the only suspect. And it is really difficult to read because the author does write about an abusive relationship, so there is a trigger warning right from the beginning. The author didn't take inspiration from the R. Kelly situation, but I think she does talk about it in the author's note at the end. And I did think that the mystery was very interesting. The solve was also really interesting. It wasn't anything that I guessed at all. So it was very surprising to read. There's just some things that don't sit right with me. For example, there's this character, I don't want to spoil for anybody, but there's this character that nobody remembers essentially towards the end. And then it makes Enchanted seem like she's crazy, which I just, And that is the only thing that doesn't sit right for me, because it's just really weird that no one remembers her. But otherwise, it is a good book. It is a very interesting mystery. Not the easiest mystery to read. It is very, very difficult and painful a lot of the time. So read this with care and consideration. But otherwise, it was not a horrible book. It was okay. Okay, I'm gonna go through this a little bit more quicker because I've been filming for like almost an hour now and we've only been through 4 books. Okay, so the next book I have is All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. And so this is a YA memoir, and this is a 5 out of 5 for me. One of my favorite reads. And if you know me, I'm not a huge fan of nonfiction because I do like to delve into just the fiction and escape my life. But the author talks about his coming to his identities of being Black and queer, and I think it is a very, very important read for both of you identify with these identities, but also if you want to be an ally. It is a heartbreaking memoir and also a jaw-dropping one. So good and funny at times too, so I highly recommend this one. The next book I have is Clap When You Land, also by Elizabeth Acevedo. I did really, really enjoy The Poet X, so I picked up this one as well. So it is another novel written in verse, and it's focused on these 2 sisters. They have the same father but different mother. They're different mothers. One grew up in Dominican Republic and the other one grew up in New York. And the father would fly between these 2 countries to kind of visit his own daughters. And the both of them don't know about each other until the father dies in a plane crash, and this is when he flies back to DR. And once they find out about each other, you can read that they kind of envy, or they're envious of each other's lives. So it's a very interesting read. It did make me cry a little bit as well. It's a bit emotional, but this was only a 3 out of 5 for me. It wasn't as good, I feel like, as The Poet X. There wasn't enough tension, I feel like. So basically when the sisters find out about each other, they kind of find each other in social media, and then they Skype, and there's not a lot of tension. Like, I feel like there should be more, especially if you're just meeting your sister for the first time, or an unknown sister, right, for the first time. And there wasn't much of that, I feel like. And then one of them just flies to visit the other, and it just felt really fast-paced, even though this is quite a thick book, but it did feel a little bit fast for me personally. But it is still a very good read. It is still very sweet, and I did love it. It just wasn't one of my tops this month. The next book I read is Love in Color, and this is a collection of myths retold. It's mythical love stories retold, and it was a 3 out of 5 for me. So a few of them have modern retellings, but not all of them are like that. Some of them are just retold from the woman's perspective or another person's perspective who maybe wasn't the focus of the myth when it was written or when it was produced or when it was spoken. And it was really good. I did like Shahrazad's the most. It's the Thousand Stories Arabian Nights one, and I did really enjoy that one. It made me cry a little bit as well. I gave this book a 3 out of 5. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad. I am a person who really enjoys myths, so maybe I'm biased towards this book, but I just felt like there were a little too many myths. Like, maybe 3 too many, I don't know, but there were just a few too many. I did enjoy them, but I just feel like some of the myths were ending as it was just beginning, and there wasn't enough story, or there wasn't enough that was told in some of the myths. I also did like Psyche and Eros's one. I thought that was really well written, but just some of them are a bit forgettable, and maybe it's just that it wasn't long enough. So the next book I read is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is another novel in verse. Oh my god, this is such a well-written book. I literally finished this, I think, in like 1 day, I'm pretty sure. It is so good, you guys. I think this is one of my favorites. A lot of them were my favorites, but I think this has definitely like top 3 of this month. So without even telling you what the novel is about yet, I think you can decipher that this is a 5 out of 5 for me. So it's about Michael, who is half Greek Cypriot and half Jamaican, and he grows up in the UK. And there's a lot of discovering of his identity and gender and race, and I think the author does this really, really well. Like, there's so many encounters of how he identifies or how he finds his identity, right? Like it literally starts from, I believe, kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, all the way up to university. He still doesn't really know in university because he ends up joining these different clubs or going to this kind of like, it's like the clubs day kind of thing in the UK, and he goes to the African Student Association, and he also goes to the Greek one. And both of them he doesn't really identify with because he doesn't speak Greek, or he doesn't, or I think he understands a bit, but he doesn't really speak it. And then there's instances of him not being dark enough to be part of the African Student Association. There's a lot of different things playing here, but then he doesn't really find himself until he finds drag. And that is where you can see Michael blossoming into Michael. It shows drag as the gender-bending art form that it is. It is so beautiful and it's so well celebrated, and it shows the celebration of just LGBTQIA+ people. It also shows Michael discovering sex and what that means for him and what it's like for him as well. It shows him discovering different versions of sex as well, which I thought was really interesting, whether it was romantic or not. So I really like Dean Atta's writing, and I can't wait to read more Dean Atta. I thought it was so well written. Yeah, so 5 out of 5, and definitely in the top 3 of my books this month. Next is another book I read for class, and it is Dictée by Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha. This is a complicated book. It is very, very complicated. Not just in the ideas that the author is trying to present, but also in the language that the author is trying to present. But I did give it a 4 out of 5 because it is a very rewarding book once you kind of get into the pace of it. It is a short little book, but this thing took me a long time to read and digest properly. And I don't even know if digesting it properly is the right word to say, because I don't necessarily think the author wants you to digest it properly. But there was a lot of rereads of different chapters, a lot of deep understanding, and also discussion with my class that I think that really helped propel my understanding of this novel somewhat. And so yeah, the language of this is very distorted and disorientating. And if you're familiar with Cha's work, she does talk a lot about fragmented memory and identity as well, and the complications of her history. And also her complicated understanding of the Korean history, especially in the early 20th century. I don't think the blurb / synopsis does it justice. It's not really necessarily what the blurb says it's about. Maybe you can have it as like a starting guide, but I don't really necessarily think that's a very good guide. And so she talks about a few women in this novel, and each chapter she bases off of the Greek muses, the 9 Greek muses. And she talks about the different women that has impacted her life, or that she has understanding of. So one of the women are her mother, and then the other one is Yu Gon-soon, who was a militant back in the Japanese colonization of Korea, and it is very difficult to read. So I definitely recommend this book. Just give it some time. Don't throw it away really quickly. Just give it some time to digest and understand it. Her language is very beautiful. It is very poetic. There is some verse, there is some prose, there's some autobiographical instances, but just give it some chance. It is a very rewarding read once you kind of get into it a little bit more. So yeah, 4 out of 5. I did enjoy it. Definitely not the easiest one this month. So the next novel I read was a little bit of a disappointment. I went into it with high hopes because the title was really captivating, and that is Real Men Knit. But it was just a 1 out of 5. I wanted to like it so much, okay? I really wanted to like it, but it really is just a 1 out of 5 for me. It's about these 4 adopted brothers and how they kind of want to revamp, or not revamp, but just keep their mother's knitting shop in Harlem, New York, and to keep it up and keep it going, and revamp it in a way to attract more people. So their mother passed. It starts with the mother passing, and her name's Mama Joy. So it starts with Mama Joy passing and how the brothers want to rebuild, or they're just even figuring out how to deal with the shop. One of them wants to liquidate it. The other 2 are kind of like going along, but one of them wants to keep the shop going. And then there's also this other character, Carrie, who is their childhood friend. And then she ends up falling in love with Jesse, who she's loved for a while, and it gets a bit distracting. Like, it really captivates me when it was like the boys just wanting to start this shop. I feel like Carrie took up a little bit too much space. I wished Carrie was just more of a side character. I don't mean that the romance can't still happen. A lot of times I was just waiting for something to happen with a knitting store, and then Carrie and Jesse are just like fucking or something, right? And then it just messes with the whole thing a little bit, in my opinion. I wish there was more about the brothers' relationship too, because it is quite a complicated relationship, and it's one that I feel like deserves more attention than it received. And if you know me, you know that I love romance, so I don't usually complain about it, but it just felt like this romance was very distracting. I wished it was more of like a familial or family novel. I think that would have been a bit better. And romance could have happened too, but like maybe just more subtle. Yeah. The next book I read is Felix Ever After. And this was a 5 out of 5. It is so good. So it is a YA novel about Felix Love, who cannot find love. And he knows how ironic that is too. And it is about Felix finding love, obviously, but also about Felix finding his identity. So he is trans, and then sometimes he feels like a boy and sometimes not that much. I think I'm not doing the best of explaining it, but the author presents these two arguments that I thought were very interesting to bring up here as well. And that is that whether labels or identity matters, or labeling identity matters, Felix does end up finding this support group because he's confused about his identity. And then there's people in the group who believe that identity is not important at all. You can be whatever you want, which I also agree with. But then there's these other characters also in the support group, as well as Felix, who believes that you need an identity, you need a label, because he wants to define himself. Like, he wants to use that to define himself because he is so confused of who he is, right? And then it does show Felix eventually finding what his identity is, and I don't want to ruin it for you guys because I feel like you should read it to understand it. And I don't disagree with both sides. I feel like both sides have such valid points. I think that really is up to, like the author presents, is up to the person themselves. And the way Felix finds his identity is so complicated. This whole book is about that, and it is well written because it shows how complicated, but also how much work and support people like Felix requires. And Felix is very lucky. He does receive a lot of support from his friends and family, and this is what I believe like allies should be doing essentially. But aside from Felix discovering his gender identity, it is also about, there's a crucial story, which is Felix finding his love. And I didn't expect the ending as well. It was so sweet. I cried a little bit as well. It was so beautiful and so sweet. But it starts with a very horrible and down point, and I don't even know if down point is the right word. It is way worse than a down point. And that is Felix goes to an art school, and one day he arrives to school and someone outs him. Someone finds his old picture before he transitioned and just puts it up as this big art gallery and dead names him, which is so disgusting and horrifying to read, honestly. So I guess there is this mystery because it also deals with Felix finding out who this person who outed him was. But I feel like a lot of times, even though it starts with this story, it does get pushed to the back a little bit because it's more about Felix discovering his identity and also love. But it is just a horrifying thing to find. There's a lot of different ideas that I think are important, and I cannot wrap it up in just one video. But yeah, I thought it was a really good book. I really enjoyed it so much, and definitely also in my top 3 this month. And I just love Felix so much. I think he's so sweet, and just the people around him, some people around him are very beautiful and very sweet as well. So the last book I read this month is also a non-fiction, and I feel like I need to read more of those because I don't have a lot in my collection, and that is Hood Feminism. And this was a 5 out of 5 for me, and I do consider myself a feminist. I also consider myself an intersectional feminist, but this book presents a lot of ideas of intersectional feminism that I wouldn't have understood or I wouldn't have grasped before I read this novel. And I think it's a super important read if you're a feminist, which I believe everybody should be. I don't understand why you aren't, but important read. And so well written. Each chapter is a very beautiful lesson, and the author also uses some of her own personal experiences, which I also enjoyed. But basically she presents these ideas of intersectional feminism that I wouldn't have thought were related. So for example, my favorite chapters were the chapter about hunger, so food deserts, and also housing, which I thought were very, very interesting, and how it ties back to feminism. But essentially every issue relating to women is a feminism issue, and this is a very basic description and doesn't do the book justice, so I still recommend you read this book and not just take my description of it. There's so much to unpack, and it is so educational. It is so dang good. So yeah, 5 out of 5. Okay, I've been filming for almost 2 hours now. The sun has disappeared. So that concludes my video. Those are the 12 books that I read this month. I hope you found some of your favorites. And I did read predominantly Black authors in February because it was Black History Month, but I don't want to just make this the title of my video or the focus of my video. That's why I'm kind of mentioning it towards the end, because I don't think you should only be reading Black authors or Asian authors in these cultural months. It should be throughout. We shouldn't just be reading white cis authors, which, don't get me wrong, they have great stories too, but I think reading or even watching videos or watching movies, it's important to have them come from different people of different identities, because I think that's how we learn, that's how we expand our ideas and how we expand our knowledge as well. Yeah, I hope you'll take these books with you and enjoy them as much as I did, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.